Since the dawn of modern humans, every culture and every region practiced what some would call shamanism. This mystical practice is scarcely understood, but not forgotten. In the 1960s, amateur ethnomycologist Gordon Wasson wrote his first book titled Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. After noticing the indigenous mushroom culture in Siberia, Siberian shamans would collect the fly agaric or Amanita muscaria mushrooms and either dried and ate them or would feed them to reindeer and drink the urine to get the effects free of nausea. Because this culture neighbored ancient Indian culture, Wasson surmised that the Amanita muscaria mushroom must be the lost ingredient of the drink Soma. Soma was the sacred and psychedelic beverage of ancient India. But how could this mushroom have ended up in a foreign religious sacrament? This drove Wasson to dig deeper to discover what shamanism truly is.
The term itself came from the Siberian cultures and was brought into English through Russian and German, and people started to recognize it as a phenomenon that was found in many parts of the world and started applying it to Native American practices and to Australian practices and things like this. What really is a shaman kind of depends on the perspective we take.
So the shaman is like a spiritual bounty hunter, you know, he or she deliberately, induces these altered states with drugs or other means, but then they don't sit there and have the trip. They can actually actively navigate in that world.
The shamans have attained a sufficient sophistication to explicitly understand that the vessel of alchemical transformation is the body, and the plants lift the imprisoning structures of the ego, and the ego flows out into the world.
Beyond the confines of small tribes in Siberia, author Gordon Wasson discovered that larger societies were also using psychedelic plants as a form of societal shamanic ritual.
Even in studying the Hindu culture, the Ganges River comes out of Shiva's top knot. In very many depictions, you see a picture of a cannabis leaf on top of Shiva's head, and also he's holding a vessel that contains bhang, B-H-A-N-G, which is a cannabis-containing beverage that is flavored with cinnamon and cardamom and other spices. And I was also very interested to learn about the Eleusinian mysteries.
The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece clearly had a psychedelic sacrament. We even know what it was now. It was a form of ergot, Claviceps paspali, that grows on barley. Was used in a beverage called the kykeon that initiates in the Eleusinian mysteries drank. And then they had extraordinary and life-changing experiences in the dark halls. They were addressing setting there as well. These experiences were undergone in a place called the Telestrion, which was underground and in darkness, probably dimly lit with little lamps here and there, creating a setting for the experience to unfold in. And the initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries, who included people like Plato, people like Socrates, people like Cicero, came out and afterwards reported that their lives had been utterly transformed by the experience that they had undergone. They had lost their fear of death. They knew that they were immortal spirits, that they were just temporarily housed in a human body.
From ancient India to Greece, psychedelic plants have been used for deeply spiritual quests and large-scale healing. But what was the first well-organized psychedelic society? Scholars and historians had all but given up on uncovering the mysterious beginnings of the shamanic society, when in 1976, Soviet archaeologist Viktor Saryanidi unearthed a 4,000-year-old temple complex in present-day Turkmenistan. This complex is nearly 500,000 square meters, divided into a large northern and smaller southern region. Its walls, made of clay bricks, spanned 120 by 115 meters and were reinforced by 20 rectangular towers. Roughly 1600 to 1700 BC, the northern region was burned down and the whole complex was abandoned quickly, leaving the mystery of its origins only with the artifacts found there. Author and researcher Chris Bennett spent years investigating the spread of cannabis in the ancient world and began piecing the puzzle together from this location.
The debate about Soma and Heoma, or the origins of them, has changed lately because of archaeological finds. And one of the really important ones is the work of the Russian archaeologist Victor Seryonety. He wrote about this in his book Margiana and Proto-Zoroastrianism. And Seryonety was doing work in the outer regions of Afghanistan in an area known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And in this region, he found a number of temple sites. And these were big temples, about the size of a football field. And half of the temple sites were dedicated to the preparation of this beverage, which Seryonety has identified as Soma Heoma, the sacred beverage of the Persians and the ancient Indians.
It is still debated whether this lost city of Gonur Tepe had a supreme ruler or simply an elite class and high priest. In many ways, the priests of larger civilizations mirrored the role of the predecessor, the shaman.
So the shaman, in the traditional role, is basically a liaison for the community to this realm of the supernatural, and the supernatural forces. So in that sense, it's kind of a priest-like, function.
At Gonur Tepe, the high priest was the gatekeeper to spiritual and psychedelic experiences. The psychedelic trip has been equated to a mystical experience, as it allows the user to peek behind the veil of cultural conditioning, and the high priest was the one that bestowed these vision quests upon the people. Only through his approval were commoners allowed to drink this sacrament. Gordon Wasson claimed that the Amanita muscaria mushroom was the psychoactive ingredient in Soma and Heoma because of the mushroom's common use in nearby areas. But this claim is unproven, and some believe quite implausible due to the kind of experience these mushrooms elicit. Amanita muscaria mushrooms have been known to cause euphoria, but also nausea, sweating, cramping, and salivation. So the mystery has continued through the ages, until Victor Seryonety sent scraping samples from Gonur Tepe out to be analyzed.
Based on archaeological evidence that's recently come up in the last decades, they found big bowls in the ground where the Soma would have been ground with big mortars and pestles, and then also straining devices, as well as bowls with fossilized remnants in it. And so they took some of these fossilized remnants, which was like a fossilized liquid substance, and had it tested, and they found evidence of cannabis, ephedra, and in some cases poppy. And all these plants grow in this region as well, still.
Poppy is the base ingredient for opium, which elicits a sedative and euphoric effect, while ephedra, the base ingredient for amphetamines, is a stimulant and appetite suppressant. And lastly, cannabis elicits a slightly psychedelic effect with an increase in appetite, causing this beverage to act as a symphony of mind-altering ingredients for these ancient Indo-European cultures.
And it's interesting, it has its counterpart in the Avestan religion over in Persia, where it's known as Heoma. Because of language similarities and mythological similarities, they're both Indo-European languages, this combined use and identity indicates a much older origin from an identical cult, so going considerably far back into history. We know that they were involved in trades with another Indo-European culture living in central China, known as the Gushi culture, and we found numbers of perfectly preserved specimens of both cannabis and ephedra at this site, and it's likely that these Indo-Europeans living in China who were exporting cannabis were likely the suppliers of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex's use of it and delivered by Scythians. My view is that the Chinese term for cannabis, which is huma, traveled with cannabis into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex with this name that became Heoma, and then through dialectical changes as it reached into India became Soma in the Vedic language.
Along several ancient trading routes, the nomadic horseback Scythians had burial kurgans that were recently unearthed. Not only were golden vessels found containing remnants of cannabis and opium, but the frozen tundra preserved the tattoos on their skin depicting animals warping and spiraling, as if seen in a psychedelic trance. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus recorded the funerary rites of the Scythians as they built tripod tents and fumigated cannabis seeds inside. But this wasn't the only place in history we see the use of a tent with smoke and vapor.
There is a Polish entomologist and anthropologist, Sula Bennett, who suggested that this Hebrew term, cannabosum, was a reference to cannabis, and that this reference appears for the first time in the Exodus 30:23, where God, who appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make a holy anointing oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he's to go inside this enclosed little area called the tent of the meeting. And he covers himself in this oil. Then he also places some of the oil on the altar of incense, and he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. None of the other Israelites in the biblical story ever see or hear the Lord. They can only tell if Moses is talking to the Lord, if smoke is pouring out of the tent of the meeting.
Moses is believed by historians to have lived in the 16th century BC, just after the period of Gonor Tepe and connected to the same trade routes. The phenomena of inhaling mind-altering substances in order to speak to divine sources are also seen with the Oracle of Delphi, which ranged from the 8th century BC and possibly earlier in the late Mycenaean times. The scholar Martin Litchfield West wrote that the Pythia or oracle exhibited Central Asian shamanic practices as she reportedly sat upon a tripod above a chasm from which vapors poured forth as she inhaled them and prophesied. If it is true that these age-old stories show a deep appreciation for mind-altering plants, how much farther back can we trace shamanic traditions into history?
That evidence, we first encounter it in the painted caves of Upper Paleolithic Europe, going back close to 40,000 years ago. And curiously enough, just quite recently in Indonesia was discovered a series of painted caves which date back to more or less exactly the same period, the high 30,000s, almost to 40,000 years ago in the past. There are certain types of imagery that regularly and routinely crop up in those deeply altered states of consciousness brought on by psychedelics. And it's precisely those types of imagery that we find in the ancient rock and cave art all around the world. You'll often find geometry in the paintings or engravings. You will find, and this is really quite diagnostic, you will find creatures that are referred to as therianthropes. That's from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. They're hybrid human and animal figures.
Not only were these visionary illustrations important enough to appear in humanity's earliest art in the painted caves, but they were also immortalized in the flesh, as the therianthropic paintings on the cave walls conjure similar imagery to that of the Scythian tattoos. There are remnants of shamanic practices in every corner of the globe. Might we also find references to psychedelics in the creation myth of the Bible?
If you look at the imagery that is conjured up of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I mean, I'm not saying that painters in the 14th century actually saw the serpent in the Garden of Eden, but if you look at the imagery that's conjured up, very often, actually I would say about 8 times out of 10, you'll find that that serpent is a therianthrope, that serpent has a serpent body and a human head. For example, or may be equipped with arms and legs branching off that serpent body in some cases. So right there's a suggestion that we're dealing with a classic entity of vision. In the mainstream, Christian position on the serpent in the Garden of Eden is that it represents the devil, the bad guy who's come to tempt and mislead Adam and Eve. But the very powerful alternative point of view provided by the Gnostics is that the serpent was one of the ancient teachers of mankind, that he's coming to say to Adam and Eve, you need to learn the difference between good and evil. If you go back to the book of Genesis, the forbidden fruit is the knowledge of good and evil. That's what that tree is. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and its fruit is therefore the knowledge of good and evil. But is there a deeper layer to that? Could we indeed be talking about some kind of natural psychedelic?
What would it mean to discover that the forbidden fruit that the parents of our species ate was psychedelic in nature? And is it possible that this fruit initiated the rapid expansion of the human neocortex?
Well, there's an interesting set of findings about how humans differ from our chimpanzee relatives in terms of the use of these psychedelics and what happens in the body. The human serotonergic system is much more sensitive to these substances. The binding of the serotonin neuroreceptors with these psychedelics is 2 to 4 times more powerful than what happens in chimpanzees.
John McPartland and Dr. Jeffrey Guy, the founder of GW Pharmaceuticals, they both have speculated that cannabis may have played a role in this time period, that the psychoactive effects of cannabis may have resulted in new, novel ways of thinking and approaching problems. And the creativity aspect may have provided that element for the great leap forward, you know.
Another theory popularized by the McKenna brothers was the potential for coprophilic spores, or rather manure-loving mushroom species like psilocybin, as being the impetus for humanity's great leap forward. Cattle worship is seen throughout ancient Egypt, Greece, Israel, Rome, Germany, and is seen in Jainism, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism. Our ancient ancestors, seeking food in the plains and grasslands, would have eventually found the cattle that grazed in the fields, and noticed a strange mushroom that grew from their droppings that influenced the lingual and problem-solving regions of the brain. Were cannabis and psychedelic mushrooms possible causes for such drastic differences in intelligence between modern humans and our ancestors? How much of our modern society has been influenced by our shamanic roots?
Really, it's out of shamanism come the roots of religion, for sure, pharmacology, but chemistry and poetry and theater and all of these things really find their roots in shamanism.
There's a certain point when religion doesn't want the shamanism in it anymore. That's really where we see the decline of the shamanic use of these substances as religions become more politically motivated as a means of controlling society and organizing society. There became, I think, both a theological and political desire to unify the people under one consolidated head and rule.
As religious institutions and political leaders began combining their powers, as we see mirrored in major corporate mergers today, the momentum was to keep spreading. And at the start of what we call the modern period, European nations began sending forces to the Americas, and as a result, indigenous tribes were decimated and countless generations of shamanic wisdom was erased from the earth. Was there an agenda? If so, what was the purpose?
I do believe that there are many forces that see the psychedelic movement as a threat, and it's vast. In earlier times, it might have been the church, but I also see that it's a threat to the pharmaceutical industry.
Big Pharma imported $86 billion in drugs and exported $47 billion worth in 2015 alone. The power of this industry and its advertising sector has forced the world of shamanism beneath the shadow of Western medicine. But what truly is the difference between the two?
In shamanism, when you have sickness, when you have an ill individual for any reason, you don't do what Western medicine does and look for the causes of that illness at the level of the physical being. The causes of that illness are always one level above. They're at the next level, in the spiritual dimension. There's a spiritual disconnect, which is the source of this illness. So the shaman will address the spiritual problem, the non-physical problem, in order to step down and solve the physical problem. In Western medicine, we have no such concept, because Western medicine doesn't even believe in the spirit or the soul or any such aspect of human beings. But Western medicine really does regard human beings as rather clever and sophisticated meat robots. Okay, but that is not the shamanistic view. The shamanistic view is that we are immersed in an incredibly complex, multi-layered reality. And that what is happening at other levels of that reality directly impact what happens at the level of reality that we inhabit.
This perspective on the nature of healing is summarized by radio host and filmmaker Max Egan, who has spent years traveling the world to visit shamanic tribes to preserve their wisdom.
Shamanism, it can be seen as something integral to the human experience. You know, I'm a firm believer that all life progresses according to the Fibonacci sequence. If you look at Fibonacci's sequence, how that sequence works is you actually get the present and you combine it with the past to create the future. That's how it works. If we can get our present culture and combine it with these past ways, we will create a viable future. But if we discard all of that ancient knowledge and simply go with our technological flow, we're going to lead ourselves to a very bad place.
A few modern healers, such as Kimba Aram, utilize ancestral and modern techniques in her alternative practices, and her experience has taught her where the healing intelligence truly lies in terms of shamanic ceremonies.
And I actually see that rather than the shaman is healing them, that the shaman is activating that person's own inner healing ability. Because that's really the true power, is reminding people that they too are the divine. We're the healer. Like if you cut your finger, you're the one who heals it. The doctor, the shaman, can help address the wound, but we're actually doing the healing work.
Perhaps it is the adoption of unhealthy patterns that builds and obstructs the pure healing intelligence within each of us. So if we look beyond the cultural adornments and poetic language, might we find a more scientific basis to shamanic rituals?
One of the things that they did was use ritual practices, including chanting and singing and drumming, that began to change our brainwave pattern. The alteration of consciousness in the shamanic ritual starts off with a stimulatory phase, dancing, drumming, singing, chanting, to the point of exhaustion, into the relaxation phase. Well, this is a shift from stimulating the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that relaxes us. And so basically the relaxation response is part of what's brought about by ritual activities.
American-based psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich mentioned a similar pattern when he spoke about the 4 stages of a primal pattern that healthy cultures share: tension, charge, discharge, and relaxation. It is seen in the movement of many forms of classical and modern music, all forms of storytelling, lovemaking, as well as healing catalysts. Even though the content on top of this pattern will always change, the underlying flow is what establishes a space for a healing response. Something must dredge up the traumatized psychological material from the unconscious, which would be during the stimulatory phase. The contents must be processed, breathed through, and exacerbated in order to bring about a critical point when the psyche transforms the way it holds that content. Finally, the discharge is a pivot point in which breakthroughs are made, not by the shaman, but by the natural healing intelligence of the one who's seeking the remedy. This leads to the relaxation phase, which allows a new and healthy pattern to integrate. This is the same as what's seen in the Shavasana stage of yoga. What other shamanic anomalies may have a physiological and neurological basis?
It's by agreement. There's a marker at the beginning and at the end. You invoke the spirits at the end, you thank the spirits and each other at the end, and you move into ordinary time, ordinary really space-time. So that's the significance of ritual. It's a fantastic, to do it in the right ways, then it opens up fantastic possibilities, because then people feel safe. If, for example, if you're in a ritual and you're exploring something, and you're, say, psychologically, you're working on your relationship with your mother or your father or some traumatic thing, and people are laughing back in the dining area, cracking jokes and, drinking whatever, beer. What's that going to be like? It's not respectful of people, and it's like trying to do therapy in the middle of the subway.
It is likely that in traditional shamanic communities, the whole group was not only involved in the ceremony, but they all had similar belief systems, allowing all of them to be more rooted in the customs of their ritual. If one person was experiencing a healing crisis, the rest of the group was likely holding space for their healing rather than distracting them with unnecessary noise or movement. If they understood the basic criteria for psychological healing, are there other shamanic anomalies that may have a physiological or neurological basis?
Shamanism has certain characteristics that are pretty much universal. And a lot of what the shaman does is retrieve souls. Illness, mental and physical illness in these cultures is often understood as a loss of souls. The idea that a shaman is a soul traveler will often go to what's conceived as the center of the universe, you know, the world tree.
There's a well-known phenomenon of the out-of-body experience or astral projection. Well, what we know is that there's a particular part of the brain that's supposed to integrate our sense of self with our body, the temporal parietal junction. And when this part of the brain is taken offline, then we're able to experience ourselves independent of our body.
Does this mean that the shaman simply convinces his or her own brain that the mind and body are separating? And if so, does that mean that it's just a mirage? Or is belief, imagination, and creativity the physical mechanisms by which an aspect of the shaman leaves his or her body to perform work in other dimensions? Perhaps this is the underlying knowledge that shamans utilized when crafting a healing environment.
Shamans become healers, they become good artists, they can design their own rituals, they create their own music and so on. Again, what makes the shaman a shaman is that he or she had a substantial number of personal experiences.
Through lifetimes of shamanic experiences, bringing wisdom from the other side to this physical world. Could this be the basis of all shamanic rituals? What would the shamans of today look like? Would they still be wearing the same clothes and singing the same songs? Or would they be doing brand new work with the same spirit, joining hearts and hands in ancestral twine, as Xavier Rudd would say? And if shamans of the past did healing work for their village, what would a modern shaman truly use to get their music and their message to the people? If this shamanic power is still present today, it would be present within all of us, and the real tragedy from there would be to remain ignorant of this gift. The modern mindset seems to marvel at the latest and greatest technology while disregarding the importance of our heritage. What if this is exactly why the health of the masses and the health of the planet is struggling to keep up with the rapid changes that we are causing? What if the passing of each generation to the next is a direct connection to our shamanic ancestry, and the biological technology of the human body remembers all that our lineage has been through? And what if the remedy to all our human problems is simply to remember who and what we truly are, embodied in the heart and soul? If psychedelic plants and shamanic rituals are a vital key to unlocking our past, is this why they've been suppressed, feared, and crusaded against in the old world as well as the new? In the late 1400s, as European naval forces set out to the New World, they would soon stumble upon shamanic tribes in every corner of the Americas with a rich history in using psychedelic plants. One such region in South America would soon reveal an ancient psychedelic cocktail of several botanicals. Was there any connection between this ancient religious sacrament and the old world's soma and heoma? Or is the shamanic phenomena of seeking deeply expanded states of consciousness through plant medicines an innate function of those people that lived closest to nature? Up next, join us as we explore the deep mysteries of the Amazon rainforest and the ancient shamanic traditions that live there.